The scream that tore through the twilight forest sent every bird within 100 yards scattering into the darkening sky, but there was no one close enough to hear it except the trees themselves. Penelope Zimmerman had been warned about riding out this far alone, but she had always been stubborn, a trait her father said she inherited from her late mother, along with those green eyes that could stop a man's heart. At 22 years old, she had lived in Murphy's, California for 3 months now, having traveled west from Boston after her father struck a modest vein of gold in the foothills. The year was 1871, and the town still buzzed with the energy of men seeking fortune, though the rush had cooled considerably from its fever pitch 2 decades prior. The forests surrounding the mining town were dense with ponderosa pines and sugar pines that reached toward heaven, their trunks thick as wagon wheels, and Penelope had developed a fascination with the landscape that was so utterly different from the manicured gardens and cobblestone streets of her childhood. She had ridden out that afternoon to sketch the wildflowers that bloomed in a meadow she had discovered the week before, a riot of lupines and Indian paintbrush that seemed to glow in the mountain light. Her father had been deep in the mine with his partner, and she had left a note that she knew he would not see until evening. The ride should have taken less than 2 hours round trip. She should have been home before the sun dipped behind the western peaks. But her mare, a gentle creature named Daisy, had spooked at a rattlesnake coiled on the trail. The snake had not struck, merely rattled its warning, but Daisy had reared so violently that Penelope, caught off guard while adjusting her sketchbook in her saddlebag, had been thrown clear from the saddle. She hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs, and by the time she gasped in a breath and pushed herself upright, Daisy was gone, thundering back down the trail toward home with all of Penelope's supplies still strapped to the saddle. That had been 3 hours ago, when the sun was still a hand's width above the mountains. Penelope had started walking, following what she thought was the trail back to town, but the paths through these forests all looked similar, and, in her dazed state from the fall, she had taken a wrong turn. Then another, the forest had swallowed her whole, and by the time she realized she was truly lost, the sun had set completely, leaving only the weak light of a crescent moon filtering through the canopy above. The temperature dropped fast in the mountains at night, even in late June. Penelope's riding dress, appropriate for the warm afternoon, offered little protection against the chill that settled into the forest like a living thing. She wrapped her arms around herself and kept walking, though she had no idea anymore which direction might lead to safety. Every tree looked the same, every rock, every fallen log, every patch of ferns seemed to repeat endlessly in the darkness. She had screamed earlier out of frustration and fear, hoping against hope that someone might be nearby, but the only response had been the echo of her own voice bouncing back from the canyon walls somewhere to her left. Now she tried to think rationally, to remember what her father had told her about survival, but her mind felt sluggish and her body ached from the fall. There was a knot on the back of her head that throbbed with each heartbeat, and she wondered if she had hit it harder than she initially thought. Keep moving or stay put? She could not remember which was the right choice. If she stayed in one place, would anyone be able to find her in this vast wilderness? But if she kept walking, might she wander even farther from civilization? The questions circled in her mind like vultures, and she found herself sinking down against the trunk of an enormous pine, her legs simply giving out beneath her. She would rest for just a moment, just long enough to catch her breath and think clearly, just long enough to stop the spinning in her head. Miles away in Murphy's, Penelope's mare had arrived at the Zimmerman house with an empty saddle, reins trailing in the dirt, and Thomas Xavier had been standing in the street when it happened. Thomas was 26 years old, lean and weather-beaten in the way of men who spent their lives outdoors. He had been working cattle since he was 14, had driven herds from Texas to California twice, and now worked as a ranch hand for the Silver Creek Ranch just outside of town. He had dark hair that tended to fall across his forehead, no matter how many times he pushed it back, and brown eyes that seemed to notice everything. He was in town that evening to pick up supplies and maybe have a whiskey at the saloon before riding back to the ranch. But those plans evaporated the moment he saw the riderless horse. Thomas knew horses the way some men knew books. He could read their moods, their injuries, their stories written in the way they held their weight or flicked their ears. This mare was frightened but uninjured, her saddle still cinched properly, the stirrups swinging free. Someone had come off, and recently. The horse's flanks were still damp with sweat, her nostrils flared and red-rimmed. "Easy, girl," Thomas said, catching the reins gently. The mare trembled, but allowed him to run his hands over her legs, checking for injuries. Nothing. He looked at the saddle more carefully and saw a woman's side saddle, well-made leather with brass fittings. There was a sketchbook strapped to the saddlebag, and when he opened it carefully, he found detailed drawings of flowers and landscapes, all signed in the corner with the initials PZ. His stomach dropped. He knew whose horse this was. Penelope Zimmerman was new to town, but impossible not to notice, with her Eastern manners and her habit of riding out alone to paint the scenery. Thomas had seen her a handful of times, had even spoken to her once when she came into the general store while he was buying tobacco. She had asked him about the best trails for wildflowers, and he had stammered out directions like a schoolboy, cursing himself afterward for his awkwardness. She had smiled at him, though, a real smile that reached her eyes, and thanked him with genuine warmth. Now her horse had come back without her, and the sun was already down. Thomas did not hesitate. He led the mare quickly to the Zimmerman house and pounded on the door. When Penelope's father answered, still covered in rock dust from the mine, Thomas explained the situation in the rapid sentences. Robert Zimmerman's face went white, then red with panic. Within minutes, he had grabbed a rifle and a lantern, but Thomas put a hand on his arm. "Mr. Zimmerman, I know you want to search, but you are not going to be able to track at night, especially not in the state you are in. You are tired from working all day, and panic will make you sloppy. I have been tracking cattle and horses through rough country for more than a decade. Let me go. I will find her." "Then I am coming with you," Robert said, his voice shaking. "No, sir, with respect, you will slow me down. I can move faster alone, and I know these mountains. You should gather some other men and be ready to ride at first light if I have not returned. That way, if I need help, I will have it come dawn." It took another 5 minutes of convincing, but finally Robert Zimmerman agreed, though Thomas could see it was tearing the man apart. Thomas understood. If it were his daughter out there in the dark, he would want to tear the forest apart with his bare hands. But wanting and doing were different things, and what Penelope needed right now was not emotion, but skill. Thomas retrieved his own horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Bronco, from the hitching post outside the saloon. He grabbed his bedroll, his rifle, extra rope, matches, and a tin of coffee. He filled his canteen at the pump and strapped 2 lanterns to his saddle. Then he led both Bronco and Penelope's mare, Daisy, back out of town toward the eastern trails. The mare would remember where she had been spooked. Horses almost always did. Thomas gave Daisy her head, letting her choose the path, and sure enough, she led him unerringly up a trail that wound into the foothills. The night was dark, the crescent moon offering barely enough light to see the trail, but Thomas had learned long ago to trust his horse's night vision more than his own. Bronco followed steady and sure-footed, and Thomas kept his eyes scanning the darkness, calling out every few minutes. "Miss Zimmerman! Penelope! Can you hear me?" Only silence answered, broken occasionally by the hoot of an owl or the rustle of some small creature in the underbrush. Thomas tried not to think about mountain lions or bears, though both were common enough in these parts. He tried not to think about how cold it got at night, or how a woman in a riding dress would have no protection against the elements. He just kept riding, kept calling, kept watching. An hour into the ride, Daisy stopped abruptly and tossed her head, dancing sideways. Thomas dismounted and examined the trail carefully with his lantern. There, coiled at the edge of the path, was a large rattlesnake, probably the same one that had spooked the mare earlier. It rattled lazily at the light, but did not strike. Thomas gave it a wide berth and continued forward on foot, leading both horses. 50 yards further, he found the place where Penelope had fallen. The evidence was clear in the disturbed pine needles and the scuff marks in the dirt. He studied the ground carefully, reading the story written there. She had gotten up, had stood here for a moment, probably watching her horse disappear. Then she had started walking, and here was where Thomas's tracking skills became essential. Her footprints were light but visible in the soft earth. She wore small boots with a distinctive tread pattern. Thomas followed the prints, moving slowly, crouched low with his lantern. The trail was easy at first, but then she had veered off the main path onto what looked like a deer trail. His heart sank. She had gone the wrong direction, heading deeper into the forest instead of back toward town. He remounted Bronco and continued following her tracks, calling out regularly. The deer trail wound through increasingly rough terrain, and Thomas realized with growing concern that Penelope had probably become completely disoriented. The tracks meandered, sometimes doubling back, showing confusion and growing panic in their irregular pattern. 2 hours past midnight, Thomas found where she had stumbled and fallen, catching herself on her hands. There were palm prints in a soft patch of moss. He was getting closer. She was slowing down, tiring. He urged Bronco faster, but the terrain forced caution. A lame horse would help no one. "Penelope!" he called, louder now. "Miss Zimmerman, can you hear me? It is Thomas Xavier from town. I am here to help you." Still nothing. The forest swallowed his words like water into sand. Dawn was perhaps 3 hours away when Thomas found another sign, a torn piece of fabric caught on a low branch. Dark blue material that matched the riding dress he had seen Penelope wear in town. He was definitely on her trail. She had come through here, probably in complete darkness, stumbling through brush and branches. He pressed on, every sense alert. His eyes ached from staring into the darkness, and his voice was growing hoarse from calling, but he did not stop. Could not stop. Somewhere out here was a frightened woman who had probably never spent a night outdoors in her life, and he would be damned if he let her suffer until morning. Then, just as the first gray hints of pre-dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, he saw something that did not belong. A shape against a tree trunk that was too regular, too light-colored to be natural. Thomas's heart kicked into a gallop. He dismounted and ran forward with his lantern raised. Penelope was slumped against the base of an enormous pine tree, her arms wrapped around herself, her head tilted to one side. She was not moving. Thomas's chest constricted with fear as he dropped to his knees beside her, setting the lantern down with shaking hands. "Penelope," he said urgently, touching her shoulder gently. She was cold, far too cold. "Penelope, can you hear me?" For a terrible moment, she did not respond, and Thomas felt the world tilt sideways. Then her eyelids fluttered, and she drew in a shuddering breath. Her eyes opened, unfocused and glazed with exhaustion and cold. "Am I dead?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No," Thomas said, and the relief that flooded through him made his hands shake. "No, you are alive. I found you. You are going to be all right." Her eyes tried to focus on his face, and he saw the moment recognition flickered in them. "The cowboy," she murmured, "from the store." "Thomas," he said. "My name is Thomas. Can you move? Are you hurt?" "I fell," she said slowly, as if her thoughts were moving through molasses. "My head. Everything hurts. So cold." Thomas could see she was suffering from exposure, and probably a concussion from the fall. Her lips had a bluish tint in the lantern light, and her whole body was shivering. He needed to get her warm immediately. Dawn was coming, but they were still hours from town, and he did not want to risk moving her too quickly in her condition. "I am going to take care of you," he said, speaking slowly and clearly. "I am going to get you warm, and then we are going to get you home. Do you understand?" She nodded weakly, and Thomas went into action. He had been a cowboy long enough to know how to make a camp in any conditions. He quickly cleared a space near Penelope's tree and built a small fire with wood he gathered from nearby. The flames caught quickly in the dry pine needles he used for kindling, and soon a cheerful blaze was pushing back the darkness and cold. Next, he retrieved his bedroll and wrapped it around Penelope's shoulders, then gently lifted her closer to the fire. She was lighter than he expected, and he could feel how badly she was shaking. He wished he had thought to bring more blankets, but he had not expected to find her in such bad condition. "Here," he said, pulling out a small flask of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes. "Just a sip. It will help warm you up." Penelope took the flask with trembling hands and sipped, then coughed. But color began to return to her cheeks, and the shivering lessened slightly. Thomas put coffee on to boil in his tin pot and watched her carefully. She was remarkably beautiful, even disheveled and exhausted, with leaves in her dark hair and dirt on her face. But more than that, she had a quality he could not quite name, something in the set of her chin and the way she was trying to gather herself, despite her ordeal, that spoke of inner strength. "Your father is beside himself with worry," Thomas said as the coffee began to bubble. "Your horse came back to town with an empty saddle right around sunset." "Daisy," Penelope said, and tears suddenly spilled down her cheeks. "Is she all right? There was a snake, and she reared, and I fell. I tried to follow her, but I could not find the way. I kept walking, and everything looked the same, and then it got dark, and I just..." Her voice broke, and she put her face in her hands. Thomas felt his heart twist. Without thinking, he moved closer and put his arm around her shoulders, careful to keep the gesture respectful but comforting. Daisy is fine, not a scratch on her. She is actually here with me. She helped me find you, led me right to where you fell. You are safe now. That is all that matters. Penelope leaned into him slightly, and Thomas could feel her exhaustion. I was so scared, she whispered. I thought I was going to die out here, and no one would ever find me. I kept thinking about my father, about how he would blame himself. I kept thinking about all the things I never got to do, never got to see. You are not going to die, Thomas said firmly. I promise you that. In a couple of hours, when you are warmer and stronger, we are going to ride back to Murphy's, and you are going to have a hot bath and a warm bed. Your father will probably not let you out of his sight for a month, but you are going to be fine. She laughed weakly at that, and Thomas felt an unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. He poured coffee into his tin cup and handed it to her, watching as she wrapped both hands around it and breathed in the steam gratefully. They sat together as dawn painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, the forest coming alive around them with birdsong and the rustle of animals beginning their day. Thomas kept the fire going and watched Penelope gradually recover, her color returning, her shivering subsiding. She drank the coffee slowly and ate some of the jerky he offered from his saddlebag, though she said her head still ached fiercely. I am sorry to be so much trouble, Penelope said after a while, looking at him over the rim of the cup. Her eyes were clearer now, green as the pine needles above them. You must think me a foolish city girl who does not know better than to ride out alone. I think you had bad luck with a snake, Thomas said. Could have happened to anyone. And I do not think you are foolish. I think you are brave for keeping going as long as you did. I did not feel brave. I felt terrified. Courage is not the absence of fear, Thomas said. It is going forward despite it. You kept walking even when you were lost and scared. That is brave. Penelope studied him for a long moment, and Thomas felt suddenly self-conscious under her gaze. He was acutely aware that he had not shaved in 2 days, that his clothes were dusty and worn, that he probably smelled of horse and wood smoke. But she was looking at him as if seeing him for the first time, really seeing him. You searched all night for me, she said softly. You did not even know me, and you rode out alone in the dark to find me. Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude in her voice. It was the right thing to do. Anyone would have done the same. No, Penelope said. Not anyone. My father wanted to search, but you convinced him to stay behind because you knew you had a better chance of finding me. You put aside your own plans, your own comfort, to save a stranger. That is more than just doing the right thing. That is heroism. I am no hero, Thomas said, poking at the fire with a stick. Just a cowboy who knows how to track. You are a hero to me, Penelope said quietly. And when Thomas looked up, their eyes met and held. Something passed between them in that moment, something neither of them had words for yet. It was like recognition, as if their souls had known each other before this meeting, and were simply remembering. Thomas felt his breath catch in his throat. He had known Penelope was beautiful, but he had not been prepared for the force of her presence, the way she seemed to fill the space around her with light. And the way she was looking at him now, with such warmth and openness, made him feel as if he were standing on the edge of a cliff, about to fall into something vast and unknown. He cleared his throat and looked away, trying to steady himself. We should head back soon. The sun is well up now, and your father will be gathering a search party. The sooner we get you home, the better. Penelope nodded, though Thomas thought he saw something like disappointment flicker across her face. He helped her to her feet, keeping a steadying hand on her elbow as she swayed slightly. The concussion was still affecting her balance. He stamped out the fire carefully and packed up his supplies, then brought Daisy over. I think it would be better if you rode with me on Bronco, Thomas said. That way if you feel dizzy or faint, I can keep you steady. We can lead Daisy behind us. Penelope agreed without argument, which told Thomas she was still not feeling well. He mounted Bronco first, then reached down to help Penelope up. She placed her foot on his stirrup and her hand in his, and he pulled her up smoothly to sit in front of him, side saddle style, across his lap. She was warm and soft against him, and Thomas tried very hard not to think about how perfectly she fit there, How natural it felt to have his arms around her as he held the reins. They rode slowly back toward Murphy's, following the trail Thomas had marked in his mind during the night. Penelope was quiet for the first hour, and Thomas worried she might be falling asleep, but when he glanced down, he saw she was simply watching the forest pass by, her expression peaceful, despite everything she had been through. "It is beautiful here," she said eventually. "Even after getting lost, I can still see how beautiful it is. The way the light comes through the trees, the smell of the pine needles, the sound of the birds. We do not have anything like this in Boston." "Is that where you are from?" Thomas asked, glad for the conversation to distract him from his awareness of her closeness. "Yes, born and raised there. My mother died when I was 12, and it was just my father and me after that. He worked as a clerk in a law office, but he always dreamed of adventure, of striking it rich in the gold fields. After I turned 21, he finally decided to do it, sold everything we had and moved us west. Do you miss it, Boston?" Penelope was quiet for a moment. "I miss some things. I miss my friends, the theater, the bookstores, but I do not miss the narrow streets and the coal smoke, and the way everyone was always judging everyone else. Here, it feels like people can be whoever they want to be. There is more freedom, more possibility. There is more danger, too," Thomas pointed out gently. "Yes," Penelope agreed with a small laugh. "I have certainly learned that, but I would rather have freedom and danger than safety and suffocation. Does that make sense?" "It does," Thomas said, and realized he meant it. He had grown up on a small farm in Missouri, the youngest of 5 children, and had felt suffocated by the expectations placed on him. When he was 14, he had run off to join a cattle drive, and he had never looked back. The life of a cowboy was hard and often lonely, but it was his own. He understood exactly what Penelope meant about freedom. They talked as they rode, the conversation flowing easily between them. Thomas told her about his life on the trail, about the time a flash flood had nearly swept away an entire herd, about the night sky and the open plains that made a man feel both insignificant and infinite. Penelope told him about her sketching and painting, about her love of capturing the world on paper, about how frustrated she got when she could not quite get the colors right. Time seemed to fold in on itself. What should have been a long, uncomfortable ride passed in what felt like minutes. Thomas found himself laughing at Penelope's descriptions of her first encounters with Western customs, and she listened with rapt attention to his stories of life on the range. It felt easy, natural, as if they had known each other for years instead of hours. When they finally rode into Murphy's around mid-morning, half the town seemed to be gathered in the street. Robert Zimmerman was at the head of a group of mounted men, clearly about to ride out for a full-scale search. The moment he saw Penelope, he let out a cry and spurred his horse forward. "Penelope! Thank God!" He was off his horse before it had fully stopped and reaching up to take his daughter from Thomas's arms. Penelope slid down into her father's embrace, and Thomas saw tears streaming down both their faces. "I am all right, Papa," Penelope said, her voice muffled against her father's shoulder. "I am all right. Thomas found me. He saved my life." Robert Zimmerman turned to Thomas with an expression of such profound gratitude that Thomas felt uncomfortable. "I do not know how to thank you," the older man said, his voice thick. "You brought her back safe. Whatever you want, whatever I can give you, it is yours." "I do not want anything, sir," Thomas said, dismounting. "I am just glad I found her in time." But Robert Zimmerman was not a man to be put off. He insisted that Thomas come to the house, that he stay for breakfast, that he at least accept some payment for his trouble. Thomas tried to refuse, but Penelope added her voice to her father's, and eventually he found himself sitting in the Zimmerman kitchen while Robert cooked an enormous breakfast and Penelope cleaned up and changed into fresh clothes. When she returned, her hair brushed and braided, wearing a clean dress of soft gray cotton, Thomas felt his heart give an uncomfortable lurch. She was beautiful in a way that made his mouth go dry, but more than that, she was alive and safe, and he had been part of making that happen. The feeling of satisfaction that gave him was deeper than anything he had felt in a long time. They ate together, and Robert Zimmerman peppered Thomas with questions about the search, about his tracking, about his life. Thomas answered as best he could, but he kept finding his eyes drawn to Penelope, who was watching him with an expression he could not quite read. There was warmth in it, and gratitude, but also something else, something that made his pulse quicken. Finally, as the morning stretched toward noon, Thomas knew he had to leave. He had work waiting at the ranch, and he had already been gone all night. He stood reluctantly and thanked Robert for the meal. "I should be thanking you," Robert said, shaking his hand firmly. "You will always be welcome in this house, Thomas Xavier. Always." Penelope walked him to the door, and they stood together on the porch for a moment in awkward silence. Thomas wanted to say something meaningful, something that would capture what the night had meant to him, but words failed him. He was better with horses than with people, better with action than with emotion. "Thank you," Penelope said finally, breaking the silence. "I know I already said it, but I do not think I can say it enough. You saved my life, Thomas. I will never forget that." "I am just glad I found you," Thomas said. He wanted to reach out and touch her hand, wanted to tell her that searching for her had been the most important thing he had ever done. But he held back. She was the daughter of a mine owner, educated and refined. He was just a ranch hand who could barely write his own name. The gulf between them was too wide. "Will I see you again?" Penelope asked, and Thomas heard something almost like anxiety in her voice. "Murphy's is not that big," he said with a small smile. "I am sure our paths will cross." But as he rode back to the Silver Creek Ranch, Thomas could not shake the feeling that something profound had happened during that long night in the forest. He had gone searching for a lost woman and had found something he had not even known he was looking for. The realization both thrilled and terrified him. The next week passed slowly for Thomas. He threw himself into his work, repairing fences and moving cattle, but his mind kept drifting back to Penelope. He wondered how she was recovering, whether the concussion had left any lasting effects, whether she thought about him at all. He told himself he was being foolish, that a woman like her would never be interested in a man like him, but the memory of her warmth against him as they rode, the sound of her laughter, the way she had looked at him in the firelight, all of it haunted him like a sweet, persistent dream. On Saturday, he rode into town to pick up his wages and buy supplies. He was in the general store, selecting a new shirt because his old one had torn beyond repair, when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Mr. Xavier, what a pleasant surprise." Thomas turned and found himself face to face with Penelope. She was wearing a dress of deep blue that brought out the green in her eyes, and she was carrying a basket filled with art supplies. She looked healthy and vibrant, with no visible signs of her ordeal, except for a small bruise on her temple that was already fading to yellow. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "It is good to see you. How are you feeling?" "Much better, thank you. The headaches have mostly stopped, and I am sleeping well again. My father is still hovering over me like a mother hen, but I suppose I cannot blame him after what happened." She smiled, and Thomas felt something warm unfurl in his chest. They stood there for a moment, neither quite knowing what to say, until the store clerk cleared his throat meaningfully, and Thomas realized he was still holding the shirt. He paid for it quickly, and then, before he could talk himself out of it, he turned back to Penelope. "Would you like to get some coffee?" he asked. "There is a little place down the street that makes a decent cup, or so I have heard." Penelope's face lit up. "I would love that." They walked together to the cafe, a small establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Patterson, and sat at a table by the window. Over coffee and slices of apple pie, they talked like old friends. Penelope told him about the sketches she had been working on, trying to capture her memories of that night in the forest before they faded. Thomas told her about a difficult horse he had been training, a spirited mare that reminded him a bit of Penelope herself, though he did not say that out loud. "I have been thinking about you," Penelope said suddenly, setting down her fork. Her directness surprised him, but he found he liked it. She did not play games or hide behind false modesty. "I have been thinking about how you found me in the dark, about how you stayed with me until dawn, about how safe I felt with you, even in the middle of the wilderness. I have never felt that way with anyone before." Thomas felt heat rise to his face. "I was just doing what needed to be done." "No," Penelope said, leaning forward slightly. "You were being who you are, someone brave and capable and kind, someone who sees what needs to be done and does it without expecting anything in return. That is rare, Thomas. That is special." He did not know how to respond to that, so he just looked at her, and once again that current of recognition passed between them. It was stronger now, more insistent, pulling them together like a river's current. "I would like to see you again," Penelope said. "Properly, I mean, if you would like that too." Thomas felt as if the sun had suddenly come out from behind the clouds. "I would like that very much," he said. "But Miss Zimmerman, Penelope, you should know that I am just a ranch hand. I do not have much money or prospects. I live in a bunkhouse with 5 other men and own little more than my horse and my saddle. A woman like you could do much better than someone like me." Penelope reached across the table and placed her hand over his, and the touch sent electricity through his entire body. "A woman like me is not interested in money or prospects," she said firmly. "A woman like me is interested in character and courage and kindness, all of which you have in abundance. So, unless you do not want to see me, unless I am reading this all wrong, I would very much like for us to spend more time together." "You are not reading it wrong," Thomas said, and his voice was hoarse with emotion. "I have thought about you every day since that night. I just did not think I had anything to offer you." "You have yourself," Penelope said simply. "That is more than enough." From that day forward, Thomas and Penelope began courting in earnest. It was not a conventional courtship by any means. Penelope had no interest in sitting primly in parlors or attending church socials. She wanted to see Thomas's world, to understand the life he led. So, he took her riding through the hills, showed her the ranch where he worked, taught her about tracking and reading weather signs. She brought her sketchbook and captured it all on paper, filling page after page with drawings of the landscape, the cattle, and increasingly with drawings of Thomas himself. Robert Zimmerman was uncertain at first about his daughter courting a cowboy, but he could not deny that Thomas was a good man who had saved Penelope's life. And more importantly, he could see that his daughter was happier than she had been since they left Boston. She glowed with it, practically radiated joy whenever Thomas was around. That was worth more than any amount of money or social standing. Thomas introduced Penelope to his world, and she fit into it more naturally than either of them expected. She was not afraid of hard work or dirt under her fingernails. She learned to help with simple ranch tasks, to mend tack and groom horses. The other ranch hands were skeptical at first, but Penelope won them over with her genuine interest and lack of pretension. She asked them about their lives, listened to their stories, and sketched their portraits until they all felt like family. In turn, Penelope shared her world with Thomas. She read to him in the evenings, books she had brought from Boston and new ones she ordered from San Francisco. She taught him about art and color theory, about composition and perspective. Thomas found that he had a good eye for it, even if his hands were too rough and calloused for the delicate work. He loved watching her create, loved the way her face became luminous with concentration, loved the little sound of satisfaction she made when she got something exactly right. They fell in love slowly and completely, like water seeping into soil. There was no single moment when it happened, no dramatic declaration. It was in the small things, the way Thomas always made sure Penelope's horse was properly saddled before his own, the way Penelope saved the last bite of her dessert to share with him, the way they could sit in comfortable silence and feel more connected than when they talked. It was in the way their hands found each other without thought, the way their eyes sought each other across crowded rooms, the way they each felt more themselves when they were together than when they were apart. Summer turned to autumn, and the forests around Murphy's blazed with color. Thomas took Penelope to the meadow where she had been riding the day she got lost, and they stood together among the now fading wildflowers. The place that had been the site of her terror had become something else, the place where their story began. "I am glad it happened," Penelope said, leaning against Thomas's shoulder. "I know that sounds strange, but if I had not gotten lost, if you had not found me, we might never have really met. We might have just been two people passing each other in the street." "I would have found a way to meet you," Thomas said. "I was already half in love with you from that first conversation in the general store. I just did not think I had a chance." Penelope turned to face him fully, reaching up to touch his cheek. "You have more than a chance. You have my whole heart, Thomas Xavier." Thomas kissed her then, soft and sweet, and felt the last pieces of his guarded heart crack open. "I love you," he said against her lips. "I love you more than I have words for. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me." "I love you too," Penelope whispered back. "So much it scares me sometimes. So much I cannot imagine my life without you in it." They stood there in the fading light, holding each other close, and Thomas felt a peace he had never known before. He had spent his life wandering, never quite belonging anywhere, But here in Penelope's arms, he was finally home. That evening, Thomas asked Robert Zimmerman for permission to marry his daughter. Robert had been expecting it and gave his blessing without hesitation, though his eyes were suspiciously bright. "Take care of her," he said, gripping Thomas's hand. "Make her happy." "I will," Thomas promised, "every day for the rest of our lives." Thomas had saved money over the years, never having much to spend it on, and he used it to buy a simple gold band from the jeweler in town. It was not fancy, but it was solid and real, like the love it represented. He proposed to Penelope at sunrise on the ridge overlooking the town, and when she said yes through tears of joy, he felt like the richest man in California. They were married in October of 1871 in a simple ceremony at the small church in Murphy's. Penelope wore a dress of cream-colored silk she had sewn herself, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Thomas wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed, though he still felt like he was playing dress-up. But when he saw Penelope walking toward him down the aisle on her father's arm, radiant with happiness, all his nervousness fell away. This was right. This was meant to be. The wedding was small, attended by Robert, the ranch hands from Silver Creek, and a few families from town who had come to know and love the couple. Mrs. Patterson from the cafe provided the food, and someone brought a fiddle for dancing. It was simple and joyful, exactly what Thomas and Penelope wanted. The ranch owner, a man named Samuel Frost, who had always been fair to Thomas, offered them the use of a small cabin on the far edge of the property as a wedding gift. It was not much, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was theirs. Thomas spent weeks before the wedding fixing it up, repairing the roof and chinking the walls, while Penelope sewed curtains and collected furniture. By the time they moved in as husband and wife, it felt like a real home. Their first year of marriage was one of adjustment and joy. Thomas continued working at the ranch, but now he came home each night to a wife and a home instead of a bunkhouse. Penelope turned one room of the cabin into a studio where she could paint and sketch, and she began selling her work to people in town and even a few galleries in San Francisco. Her detailed drawings of life in the mining town and the surrounding wilderness found an eager market among Easterners hungry for images of the West. Money was tight, but they did not care. They were rich in the ways that mattered. They had each other, they had work they found meaningful, and they had a community that supported them. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the mountains, Thomas's arm around Penelope's shoulders, and feel completely content. In the spring of 1872, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. Thomas received the news with a combination of joy and terror that made Penelope laugh, even as tears rolled down her cheeks. They were going to be parents. They were going to bring a new life into the world. "Are you scared?" Penelope asked him that night as they lay in bed, his hand resting on her still flat stomach. "Terrified," Thomas admitted. "I do not know anything about being a father. What if I'm no good at it? What if I let you down, let the baby down?" "You will not," Penelope said with absolute certainty. "You will be an amazing father because you are an amazing man. You are patient and kind and strong. You taught me to see tracks in the forest and read the weather in the sky. You will teach our child all of that and more." "What if something goes wrong?" Thomas asked quietly, voicing his deepest fear. "Childbirth is dangerous, Penelope. I have seen it on the ranch with the cattle and horses. I could not bear to lose you." Penelope took his face in her hands and looked directly into his eyes. "I am strong and I will be careful. We will get the doctor and I will do everything right. But Thomas, I need you to believe that everything will be all right, because if you are scared, I will be scared, and fear helps no one. Can you do that for me? Can you be strong?" "I can try," Thomas said, and kissed her forehead. "For you, I can do anything." The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Penelope glowed with health and energy, continuing to paint and keep house well into her 7th month. Thomas hovered over her constantly, worrying about every little thing, until she finally had to threaten to ban him from the cabin if he did not relax. He tried, though it went against every protective instinct he had. Robert Zimmerman was over the moon about becoming a grandfather. His mind had finally begun producing consistently, and he used some of his profits to buy gifts for the coming baby: a hand-carved cradle, soft blankets, tiny clothes. He spent more and more time at the cabin, and Thomas realized that the older man had become the father he had never really had. Robert taught him things his own father had been too busy or too distant to teach, and their bond grew deep and strong. On a cold November night in 1872, Penelope went into labor. Thomas rode through a thunderstorm to fetch the doctor, his heart in his throat the entire way. The labor was long and difficult, lasting nearly 20 hours, and Thomas thought he might lose his mind from the stress of hearing Penelope's cries and being unable to do anything to help. Robert stayed with him through it all, a steady presence when Thomas felt like he was falling apart. Finally, as dawn broke on a clear, cold morning, a baby's cry filled the cabin. The doctor emerged from the bedroom with a smile on his tired face. "You have a son, Mr. Xavier, a healthy baby boy, and your wife is tired but well." Thomas practically ran into the bedroom. Penelope was propped up against pillows, pale and exhausted, but smiling, and in her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in a blue blanket. Thomas approached slowly, almost afraid to breathe, and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby was red-faced and wrinkled, with a tuft of dark hair and eyes squeezed shut against the light. He was the most beautiful thing Thomas had ever seen, after his mother. "Do you want to hold him?" Penelope asked, and Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. She placed the baby carefully in his arms, and Thomas felt something inside him shift and settle. This was his son, his family. His entire world was now contained in this small cabin, this woman, and this child. "What should we name him?" Penelope asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy, but had never quite decided. Thomas looked down at the baby, then out the window at the dawn breaking over the mountains, and thought about the night he had searched for Penelope until he found her at first light. "James," he said, "James Robert Xavier after your father, if that is all right with you." Penelope's eyes filled with tears. "It is perfect." Robert Zimmerman wept openly when they told him, and from that day forward, he was a devoted grandfather. He helped Thomas build an addition onto the cabin, creating more space for the growing family. He taught young James his letters and numbers when the time came. He was a constant, loving presence in all their lives. The years that followed were full and rich. Thomas was promoted to foreman at the Silver Creek Ranch, overseeing the other cowboys and managing the cattle operations. The increase in pay allowed them to improve the cabin further, and even save a bit of money. Penelope's art business flourished, and her paintings began to hang in galleries across California. But she never let success change her. She remained the same warm, genuine person Thomas had fallen in love with. James grew into a sturdy, curious boy who loved nothing more than following his father around the ranch. Thomas taught him to ride almost as soon as he could walk, and by the time he was 5, James was a competent horseman. He had his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair, and he had inherited the best qualities of both: Penelope's creativity and curiosity, Thomas's steadiness and skill. In the spring of 1875, Penelope became pregnant again. This time, the pregnancy was easier, and she gave birth to a daughter in December. They named her Clara Rose Xavier, and she was a tiny, delicate thing who looked like a porcelain doll. Where James was adventurous and bold, Clara was thoughtful and gentle. She would spend hours watching her mother paint, and as soon as she was old enough to hold a pencil, she began creating her own art. Thomas sometimes had to pinch himself to believe his life was real. He had gone from being a rootless cowboy with nothing but a horse and a saddle to being a husband, father, and respected member of the community. He had a home, a family, and a love that deepened with every passing year, all because of a rattlesnake on a trail and a woman who got lost in the forest. He and Penelope often talked about that night, especially on their anniversary. It had become their tradition to ride out to the place where he had found her, to stand among the trees and remember. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if things had been different?" Penelope asked one anniversary when they were in their early 30s, James and Clara spending the day with their grandfather. "If someone else had found me, or if I had not gotten lost at all." "All the time," Thomas admitted. "And then I thank God that things happened exactly as they did, because I cannot imagine my life without you in it. You are my home, Penelope. You and the children. Everything good in my life traces back to that night." "I feel the same way," Penelope said, leaning into him. "Sometimes I think I was meant to get lost, just so you could find me. Not just find me in the forest, but find me in life. And I found you. We found each other." They kissed, still as much in love as they had been that first dawn, maybe even more so. Love that had been tested by life and had only grown stronger. Love that had created a family and built a home. Love that would last. The years continued to pass. Robert Zimmerman eventually sold his mine for a tidy sum and built a comfortable house in town, where he lived contentedly, spending most of his time with his grandchildren. Thomas and Penelope watched their children grow, James becoming a skilled ranch hand like his father, Clara developing into a talented artist like her mother. In the spring of 1880, Penelope surprised Thomas with the news that she was pregnant again, at the age of 31. They had thought their family was complete, but life had other plans. That December, she gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Samuel, after the ranch owner, who had been so good to them, and Ellen, after Thomas's mother, whom he barely remembered, but honored nonetheless. The cabin was bursting at the seams, so Thomas and a crew of ranch hands built a proper house on the land that Samuel Frost sold to them at a generous price. It was not a grand house by any means, but it had 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen, and a wraparound porch where they could sit in the evenings. Penelope created a studio in the attic where the light was perfect, and Thomas built a barn for their horses. They were happy. Not in a fairy tale way where nothing ever went wrong, but in the real deep way that came from facing challenges together and coming out stronger. There were hard times. Years when the cattle prices dropped and money was tight. Winters when illness swept through the town, losses of friends and loved ones. But through it all, Thomas and Penelope had each other, and that made everything bearable. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1891, Thomas organized a surprise party. The whole town turned out, it seemed, to celebrate the couple who had become beloved fixtures in the community. There was food and music and dancing, and speeches about how Thomas and Penelope represented the best of what the West could be: hardworking, generous, devoted to each other and their community. As the sun set and the party wound down, Thomas and Penelope slipped away to their favorite spot on the ridge overlooking the valley. They stood together in the golden light, their children grown, or nearly grown, their lives full and rich. 20 years, Penelope marveled. It feels like yesterday, and like forever at the same time. Best 20 years of my life, Thomas said, though I am looking forward to the next 20 even more. And the 20 after that, Penelope added, taking his hand, and all the 20s after that, for as long as we have. They stood there together, watching the stars come out one by one, and Thomas thought about that terrified young woman he had found huddled against a tree trunk so many years ago. He thought about how a single night had changed the course of his entire life, how one act of courage and determination had led to all of this: the love, the family, the home, the life. "Thank you," he said suddenly, and Penelope looked at him in surprise. "For what?" "For getting lost," Thomas said with a smile. "For being brave enough to move west in the first place. For taking a chance on a cowboy who had nothing to offer but himself. For building this life with me. For everything." Penelope's eyes shimmered with tears, but she was smiling. "Thank you for finding me. Not just that night, but every day since. Thank you for seeing me, for loving me, for being my partner in all things. You are the best man I have ever known, Thomas Xavier. And I would get lost 1,000 times if it meant you would find me." They kissed as the stars wheeled overhead. And in that moment, they were not middle-aged parents with responsibilities and mortgages. They were simply 2 souls who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. The years continued their steady march. James grew up and married a girl from Sacramento, bringing her home to Murphy's and taking over much of the ranch operations from his aging father. Clara studied art in San Francisco and had a successful gallery, though she came home often to visit. The twins, Samuel and Ellen, were still in school, but they were growing fast, turning into young adults before Thomas and Penelope's eyes. Robert Zimmerman passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1895 at the age of 72. It was a blow to the entire family, but especially to Penelope, who had been close to her father all her life. They buried him in the Murphy Cemetery on a hillside overlooking the town he had grown to love, and Thomas held Penelope as she wept for the man who had given his blessing to their marriage and had been such a wonderful grandfather to their children. "He loved you so much," Thomas told her later that night as they lay in bed. "He told me once that bringing you west was the best decision he ever made, and not because of the gold. Because it led you to happiness, to me. He said he could die content knowing you were loved and cared for. I am going to miss him so much, Penelope whispered. He was always there, always steady and loving. I do not know how to live in a world without him. You live the way he taught you to, Thomas said, with courage and love and joy. You honor him by living well, by loving our children and grandchildren, by creating your art. He is not really gone, Penelope. He lives on in you, in our children, in the life we built. Penelope clung to him, and Thomas held her through the grief, the way she had held him through his own losses over the years. That was what marriage was, he had learned. Not just sharing the joys, but bearing the sorrows together, being strong when your partner was weak, offering comfort when words failed. In 1898, James and his wife made Thomas and Penelope grandparents for the first time. The baby girl, named Penelope after her grandmother, was the light of their lives. Thomas, now 53 years old and graying at the temples, discovered that being a grandfather was even sweeter than being a father. He could spoil little Penelope shamelessly, and then hand her back to her parents when she fussed. He carved toys for her and let her ride on his shoulders and told her stories about the old days. Penelope the elder, now 49 and still beautiful in Thomas's eyes, painted portraits of her granddaughter that captured every stage of her development. Her arthritis was starting to bother her hands, making the fine detail work more difficult, but she refused to stop creating. Art was as much a part of her as breathing, and she would paint until the day she died. As the new century dawned in 1900, Thomas and Penelope found themselves entering their later years surrounded by love. Clara had married a kind schoolteacher and given them 2 more grandchildren. Samuel was working as a foreman on a ranch in Nevada, and Ellen had just gotten engaged to a young lawyer. The cabin-turned-house that had once seemed so spacious was now regularly filled with children and grandchildren, noise and laughter and love. Thomas had retired from active ranch work, his body no longer able to handle the physical demands, but Samuel Frost's son, who now ran the ranch, kept him on as a consultant. Thomas spent his days helping James manage operations, teaching his grandsons to ride, and sitting on the porch with Penelope, watching the world go by. One evening in the summer of 1903, as they sat together watching the sunset, Penelope said, "We have had a good life, have we not?" "The best," Thomas agreed. "Better than I ever dreamed possible. Do you ever regret it? Marrying me instead of some cowboy's daughter who already knew ranch life? Your life might have been easier." Thomas turned to look at her, this woman who had been his partner for more than 30 years, and shook his head. "Easier is not the same as better. You challenged me, Penelope. You made me want to be more than I was. You brought art and beauty and culture into my life. You gave me children who are smarter and more capable than I ever was. You made every day an adventure. I have never regretted a single moment. Even when I dragged you to that terrible opera in San Francisco?" Penelope asked with a smile. "Even then," Thomas laughed, "though I still maintain that 3 hours of people singing in Italian is not my idea of entertainment. But I would sit through 100 operas if it made you happy." "I love you, Thomas Xavier," Penelope said, taking his hand. Her fingers were gnarled now with arthritis, but her grip was still strong. "I have loved you from that dawn in the forest when you wrapped me in your coat and made me coffee. I will love you until my last breath and beyond." "And I love you, Penelope Xavier," Thomas said. "You are my heart, my home, my everything." They sat together as the stars came out, the same stars that had witnessed their first kiss, their wedding, the births of their children, every major moment of their lives. They were older now, slower, marked by time and experience, but the love between them had only grown deeper and richer with the years. The next decade passed gently. Thomas and Penelope grew older but remained active and engaged with life. They watched their grandchildren grow, attended weddings and christenings, celebrated anniversaries and holidays. The house was always full of family. Multiple generations gathered around the table, telling stories and making memories. In the fall of 1912, Thomas had a mild heart attack while helping to mend a fence. It scared everyone, especially Penelope. But he recovered with rest and care. The doctor told him to take it easy, to avoid strenuous activity, and for once, Thomas listened. He was 67 years old, and his body was reminding him that he was not young anymore. That winter, as they sat by the fire, Penelope painting a landscape from memory, and Thomas reading aloud from a dime novel, Thomas realized that this was enough, more than enough. He had lived a full, rich life. He had loved deeply and been loved in return. He had raised good children and seen them settled happily. He had built something that would last beyond him, a family, a legacy of love and hard work and integrity. "What are you thinking about?" Penelope asked, noticing his contemplative expression. "How lucky I am," Thomas said simply. "How blessed. I was just a cowboy, Penelope. I had nothing to offer the world except a strong back and a good work ethic. But somehow I found you, and you made me into something more. You made me a husband, a father, a grandfather. You made my life matter." "You always mattered," Penelope said firmly, setting down her brush. "Even before me. You were a good man, Thomas, with or without me. But I am glad we found each other. I am glad we built this life together." "So am I," Thomas said. "So am I." They continued on together into their 70s, slowing down but never stopping. Thomas's heart gave him trouble occasionally, and Penelope's arthritis made painting difficult. But they adapted. They found new ways to spend their time: long talks, teaching grandchildren, tending a garden that Penelope designed and Thomas helped maintain. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1921, their children and grandchildren threw them a party that was talked about in Murphy's for years afterward. The entire town showed up, it seemed, to celebrate the couple who had become living legends. Thomas and Penelope danced together slowly to a waltz played by James's eldest son on the fiddle, and if their steps were not as sprightly as they once were, the love in their eyes was undimmed. 50 years, Thomas marveled as they swayed together. "Half a century with you, and it is still not enough. I want 50 more." "I will do my best to give them to you," Penelope said, resting her head against his chest. "Though I think we are both running on stubbornness at this point." "Stubbornness and love," Thomas corrected. "Never underestimate the power of love to keep a body going." They lived on together, into their 70s and then their 80s, which was remarkable for the time and place. They were fixtures in Murphy's, the old couple who had been married forever, who could finish each other's sentences and communicate with just a look. Young couples would come to them for advice, and Thomas and Penelope would share the wisdom earned through decades of marriage. "Always be kind," Penelope would tell them. "Even when you are angry or tired or frustrated, choose kindness. It costs nothing and means everything." "And never go to bed angry," Thomas would add. "Talk things through, even if it takes all night. Do not let resentments build up like rust on a fence. Address problems when they are small, and they will never become big." But the most important advice they gave was simpler still. "Choose each other," they would say together. "Every single day, wake up and choose your partner. Choose to love them, to support them, to be on their team. Marriage is not about grand gestures. It is about 1,000 small choices to show up, to be present, to love. If you do that, everything else will follow." In the spring of 1925, Thomas Xavier passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 80. His heart, which had troubled him for years, simply stopped. Penelope woke next to him, as she had for more than 53 years, and knew immediately that he was gone. She held his hand and wept, but beneath the grief was gratitude for the long, beautiful life they had shared. The funeral was the largest Murphy's had ever seen. Thomas had touched so many lives, had been respected and loved by everyone who knew him. He was buried in the cemetery next to Robert Zimmerman with a simple headstone that read, "Thomas Xavier, 1845-1925, beloved husband, father, grandfather. He found what he was looking for." Penelope lived on for another 2 years, still sharp-minded but physically frail. She spent her days surrounded by family, telling stories about Thomas, about their life together, about the night he found her in the forest and changed both their fates forever. She painted one last portrait, a memory of Thomas as he had been that dawn in the forest, young and strong and capable, his face illuminated by lantern light, his eyes full of determination and hope. She passed away in her sleep in October of 1927 at the age of 78, and the family buried her next to Thomas beneath a matching headstone. Penelope Xavier, 1849-1927. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, she was found. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren carried on the legacy they had built. The values they had lived by kindness, hard work, courage, love, passed down through generations. The house Thomas built still stood, lived in by James's family, filled with new voices and new love, but always honoring the memory of the couple who started it all. And sometimes, on autumn evenings when the light slanted golden through the pines, people claimed they could see two figures standing on the ridge overlooking Murphy's, a cowboy and a woman, hand in hand, watching over the town they loved and the family they created. Whether it was real or just a romantic story told around campfires, no one could say for sure, but everyone agreed that if love could transcend death, surely the love between Thomas and Penelope Xavier could. They had found each other against all odds in a dark forest, and not even death could separate them now. Their love story had become legend, told and retold through the years, inspiring others to believe that true love was real, that soulmates existed, that sometimes getting lost was just the first step to being found.